in actual Durham. And one of the things I think we're excited about going forward is the way that things like this, events like this, make it possible to have people from all over the world, in fact, come and join us. And also that we can record and people can find, what's been going on at their leisure at a later date. So, but it's really lovely to see familiar faces here. Very nice to see Mark Williams up there of the Williams Library. And I hope that Gillian might say a little bit about a little bit of the genesis of this talk and the Williams Library contribution to that. But I want to say a special thank you to Professor Gillian Foulger, who, I don't know if you can tell, she is sitting somewhere in California at the moment. Now, Gillian has a long association with St. Chad's College. She was a governor for some years. She was a tutor for many years. And she's been an important friend to St. Chad's College over a long period of time. But she's very important to us in that way, but she's actually better known than her association with St. Chad's as one of the world's most interesting earth scientists. And Gillian is interesting because she has been a key catalyst in the kind of research that questions how volcanoes are formed and how tectonic plates beneath the Earth's surface shift. And I know that the whole principle of science is it's based on questioning and overturning and finding better theories. But I think that Gillian is an absolute brilliant exemplification of this. And it's kind of a combination of never just being willing to assume things or take things for granted. And a certain kind of, I hope you'll forgive me for this, kind of bloody-mindedness that I think can be incredibly productive. And I've seen that work when Gillian's been a Chad's tutor, when she's refused to take no for an answer for one of her students. But in this context, I think it's led to some really interesting and groundbreaking research. Now, for her major contributions to scientific research, Gillian was the winner of the Royal Astronomical Society's Price Medal in 2005. And among many other honours is a Fellow of the Icelandic National Academy of Sciences and a Fellow of the Geological Society of America. And I love her title for tonight's lecture. I think it's intriguing, I think it's beautiful, and it's called In the Tranquility of St. Chad's, Discovering Icelandia, a New Continent Time. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Gillian, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from you this evening, Gillian. I guess it's morning for you, but evening in the UK.
Yes, it's 10 o'clock in the morning here, Margaret. Thank you very much indeed for that very generous and kind introduction. I appreciate it very much. So I'll switch over to my PowerPoint presentation here, and I think I click on share screen. Is that correct, Ashley?
Ashley, you're muted.
Yeah, that's correct. That's it.
So how is that looking?
Good.
Okay. So over in recent years, I've done what I consider one of the most exciting things of my career. And this baby was born, if you like, out of a series of meetings that we ran in St. Chad's. St. Chad's was a wonderful place to hold these meetings because we wanted to get the finest brains available anywhere in the world, and we wanted to put them somewhere where there were no distractions. And St. Chad's was just a wonderful place to be like that. You know, nobody was running out to restaurants, nobody was getting involved in other things. We just were able to concentrate without any disturbances whatsoever. And I want to tell you this wonderful story. So let me see how to move to the next slide. So in the beginning, I was pottering along, as we all do, just getting on with daily life. And I was privileged when this young German researcher joined my group. So he wrote to me. I didn't know him. He said he wanted to come to Durham, join the group, and he raised his own postdoctoral support money and turned up in Durham. And Christian is very good at working with other people and getting people together and making friends with them and getting them all working in the same direction, finding common ground. And before very long, another department member at Durham, so all these people were at Durham, Alexander Peace, he decided that we were doing exciting things, and he accreted to the group as well. And before very long, he had dragged along with him another person, Jordan Fithian. And I think of these three as the three musketeers, because they kind of were the engine room of all of this. Alex and Jordan were PhD students at the time. Christian was a postdoc. But I'm delighted to say they've all got wonderful jobs in academia. Christian is now at Uppsala University. Alex is at McMaster in Canada, and Jordan at the University of Derby. So, you know, one measure of how well a group does is how successful the people are who work in the group and then move on to better things. So, because we have a diverse group of expertise here in the audience, I'm going to start with some basics and just remind you a little bit of continental drift. So, this was a theory championed by Alfred Wegener about 100 years ago. Alfred Wegener was driven by observations that the geology of continents was exactly the same across wide oceans, that indications of ice caps all fitted together if you put the continents together, fossils were the same, and the shapes of the coastlines. Can you see my pointer, Ashley, where I'm pointing? Does
yes,
that
I can.
Okay, you can see what I'm pointing to then, that's good. So these coastlines just fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle, and Wegener was certain that these continents had once been joined. But as many of us know, he was not able to convince mainstream Earth scientists, essentially because he couldn't explain the oceans. So this is the blue stuff in between. People said, what about this ocean here? We know that this is rigid Earth's crust. It's floored by volcanic rocks. So what about this stuff? You know, you can't just, how are you going to move these continents, you know, through this crust? They're fixed, they're stuck, aren't they? And that was essentially really why people would not buy into it. But then came along plate tectonics, and plate tectonics did explain the oceans. So instead of just continents moving, like Africa and South America, these were broad expanses of the Earth's surface, which included both the continents and the oceans round about. So it was more than just the continents that were drifting, it was the whole plate, if you like. So plate tectonics suggested that new crust was being formed at these cracks down the middle of the oceans. And so these arrows show how it's growing and spreading out and pushing the two continents apart. And at other parts of the globe, mostly around the edge of the Pacific Ocean, one plate was, instead of growing like this, they were pushing together, and one was sliding back into the center of the Earth, into the interior of the Earth. So the Earth is staying the same size, and the oceans are growing in some places and shrinking in others. So this really explained all the difficulties. We thereafter envisaged the continents essentially as people standing on an escalator, and more steps of the escalator are pouring out of a slot at the bottom of the escalator. The people are being transported up, and right at the very top of the escalator, the escalator's disappearing back down in again and coming around in a big circle. So that's simplistically how we now measure it. And of course, everybody has bought into this now. So here we have a little video that I got off the web to show this. And if we watch Africa and South America, we can see how things go. The number in the bottom left is millions of years. So here's the continents. As soon as people accepted this, of course, a lot of progress was made. The dark red areas are the present day continents, of course, but you'll see that there are some pink areas too. These are regions of continent which are standing low and are therefore flooded by seawater. They're basically shallow seas. And we can see that the North Sea, which separates Britain from Scandinavia, this is essentially just a continuation of Britain and Scandinavia. It's just all oceanic. It just happens to stand a few hundred meters below sea level, so it's flooded with seawater, but it's basically still continent. So I'm now going to rerun this and ask you to watch the Britain and Greenland area, which is going to be the subject of the talk. So let me rerun that again. So first of all, the Central Atlantic opens here. And then the southernmost part of the North Atlantic opens here. So you see this part of the Atlantic off the northwest coast of Scotland and Ireland, this opened first. And next you'll see the Labrador Sea open here as Greenland is broken off North America. There it goes, it's starting to form. Whoops, I knew that was going to happen, Ashley. Okay, the Central Atlantic is opening. The Southern Atlantic, part of the North Atlantic is opening. And just about this time here, as you can see, the Labrador Sea is starting to open. This is going to propagate up here and break Greenland off. But this part is essentially stuck. This region here is the last to break up. We have an Arctic Ocean, we have a southern part of the North Atlantic, but this is kind of locked together. And there it goes. So this slide shows the rock that is left over after, as a consequence of this spreading phenomenon, this phenomenon of volcanic material coming up the central rift in the Atlantic, wedging itself into the crust and pushing the continents apart. So in this slide, we can see the regular sedimentary rocks here and here on the other side. And here we're looking at a great kind of slab of volcanic rock that's been thrust into this sedimentary sequence. So the crust has kind of stretched, if you like, and to take up the space, volcanic rock has come up from below and it's filled this gap with a great blade of rock, a great slab of rock that's thrust in to fill this gap. This is called a dike, and it may be several meters thick. And if you can imagine this process happening 1,000,000 times, the crust stretches, volcanic rock comes up, stretches more, volcanic rock comes up and fills the space. If that happens 1,000,000 times, then you've got the Atlantic Ocean. You've got the approximate width of the Atlantic Ocean. We see this happening at the present time in Iceland, where many people will perhaps have gone for holidays. Here, this slab of rock, which is being thrust up into the Earth's crust to take up the space where the crust is stretched, has actually broken the surface, and we see a long linear eruption. So if you wait until the eruption's over and you go down and see what's gone on there, you'll find that this part of the crust has widened by several meters. And because it broke the surface, of course, it's flowed over the surface as a lava flow. We see this kind of rock in Western Scotland as Fingal's Cave. This is a very thick lava flow, very famous, of course. And this formed at the time when the Atlantic broke up, and this process was actually active on the west coast of Britain. Here we have the Giant's Causeway. This is one of these lava flows. And here's another picture of Iceland showing a lava flow forming. So things like the Giant's Causeway are essentially forming in Iceland at the present time because Iceland is smack on this active ridge. Fortunately, we're well away from it, and so we don't expect a volcanic eruption to happen on mainland Britain anytime soon, but never say never in geology. So this is the conventional model. Simple plate boundary. Here we have the Great Crack, the mid-ocean ridge that comes up the middle of the Atlantic. conventionally it's thought to pass through Iceland, continue on north. You can see that this is a bathymetric map. So these colors represent depths of the sea floor. The purple color is deep sea floor, the blue is somewhat shallower, and the white here is even shallower still. And here's a spoiler alert. Of course, you can see that the North Sea is also white. It's also very shallow, like these regions here. Okay. So the fact that there's all these complications here and the fact that we have a huge volcanic island here has traditionally been explained as resulting from there being a so-called mantle plume under Iceland, which is envisaged to be a kind of chimney of hot rock that's rising up underneath, and it's delivering an especially large amount of volcanic rock to this part of the mid-ocean ridge. And the idea is that because there was always a huge extra amount of magmatism at Iceland, then as the plates spread apart, then unusually thick oceanic crust was formed on both sides of Iceland, forming the Iceland-Faroe Ridge here and the Greenland-Iceland Ridge. So, colleagues will know that I have contested the mantle plumes theory, and Margaret alluded to this in her introduction. So in the view of a good number of colleagues and myself, mantle plumes are not supported by the data. It sounds all very simple. Yes, you know, produce a mantle plume, volcanic island, thick crust on either side. But geologists, of course, have looked in tremendous detail at many things. We've looked at the gravity field, we've performed seismic experiments, we've taken rock samples and we've analyzed them in mass spectrometers and looked at the chemistry of the rocks. And if you look at the details, you just find you're in a huge can of worms, and the mantle plumes theory just can't explain this. So individual workers have taken the plume theory and they've said, well, my data shows such and such, and therefore it must be a different plume. It must be this kind of plume. And somebody looking at some other data will say, well, my results are this, and so it must be that kind of plume. And we're literally in a, well, not literally, but it's a very good analogy that we're in a blind men and the elephant situation, where everybody's looking at a different kind of data and they're proposing a different kind of plume, and these models can't all be right. So this troubles scientists, especially those who try to be cross-disciplinary and understand all aspects of the subject. So here we are getting on with our daily lives, and Christian comes to me one day and he says, Jill, as part of this postdoc grant that I've got, which you agreed to and everything, we said that we would run a scientific meeting. So oops, better run one then, hadn't we? So I thought to myself, I've been running the Mantle Plumes website for about 20 years now, and I've posted stuff about Iceland on it myself, and many other people have also sent contributions to the website saying, Iceland, there can't be a plume under Iceland because of this, there can't be a plume under Iceland because of that. But we never really came up with a theory that I felt satisfied all of the data. And so I thought, well, why don't we get all of these losers together and just brainstorm this, and maybe if we could put all the pieces of the jigsaw together, maybe we can see what the picture is. So this was really just a sort of thing that I did on a gut feeling. I hate to sound like Donald Trump, but I'd got a feeling that there was enough of the jigsaw out there that we could find out, really what was going on. And I have to say, this was one of the most successful enterprises that I have ever gone into. I've done a lot of big experiments in my life. I've worked very hard, but I can remember when Christian came into my room and said, we're supposed to be running a meeting, and out of this seemingly almost insignificant little exchange came this wonderful thing. So we put together Christian and Alex helping him, and Jordan also. They did all the heavy lifting, and they negotiated with Chad's for catering. They booked a restaurant, and they this and that and the other. They did all the kind of donkey work, arranging accommodation and everything. And I just made up a list of all the usual suspects who were sort of bloody-minded and refusing to accept conventional wisdom. And we said, we're going to have a meeting, get everybody together and hear what we're all going to say. And this had something like 100% take-up. I've never experienced such an enthusiastic take-up from colleagues before. I think all the stars were in alignment, because several colleagues told me that their projects were at a particular stage where it was particularly helpful to run this meeting. So people just came from all over. And we structured it in a somewhat unusual way. We had about 20 people come to the first meeting. It was invitation only. And we said this meeting is going to last 2 days, and each person is only going to be allowed to have a 10-minute presentation. All the rest of the time is going to be discussion. So Alex and Christian say, well, you know, how are we going to manage to keep the discussion going? And I said, the problem won't be keeping the discussion going. The problem will be shutting them up. And that certainly turned out to be the case. So here we are, beavering away in the Williams Library. These two gentlemen here came from France. Well, this gentleman came from France. This is a French gentleman from Norway. Here is Christian. This person came from Iceland. Professor Kuznia came from the University of Liverpool. There's a gentleman who's hidden behind Margaret here in my screen anyway. He came from the German Geological Survey. Here we have Christian again. This gentleman was a professor at Miami who's now living in Hawaii. And this gentleman over on the right here is a geophysicist from Hawaii. I was lucky to have a bit of research slush money, really, to run this, to pay for the meeting and the room and the food and all the rest of it. And to be able to fly in people who I felt were key, who didn't actually happen to have a grant or funding that could pay for their travel. So I paid to have these two people fly in from Hawaii. And they came to every single meeting. And really, I don't think they came for fun. They were traveling for 2 days to get here, 2 days at the meeting, and then a day and a half flying back. So I don't believe they'd come just to enjoy some sightseeing. This gentleman is a senior researcher in the Statoil company. Of course, the borders of the Northeast Atlantic along the Norwegian seaboard and the North Sea is very oil rich. So the oil company's got a great interest in this. And regardless of what we say, we have to put petrol in our cars at the moment. This lady is from Norway. And the gentleman hidden behind Ashley on my screen is from the British Geological Survey in Edinburgh. So we had this big international group. I mean, we just paid absolutely no attention to anything except who was unhappy with things that weren't explained by the standard model. And we just invited those people, and that was it, even if they were in Hawaii. So within a few minutes, we'd all agreed that this model could not fit the observations, and we started all saying what we felt didn't fit with it. This is a close-up which shows a little bit more detail. So here again, we're looking at bathymetry. Here we have the mid-ocean ridge, which is a long line of volcanism, and these two sides are moving apart. You'll notice that the seafloor to the west of the Reykjanes Ridge is narrower than the seafloor to the east. So that's one strange thing. Another strange thing is that we seem to have two ridges to the north. There's one ridge here and one ridge here. Well, this ridge is the one that's currently active and about which seafloor spreading is going on. And this one is an old extinct ridge. So originally, this ridge formed and this one formed, and then this one became extinct and it jumped to a position which was then in Greenland, and it split off a big chunk of Greenland. So when this ridge was active, all of this was Greenland, basically. And then it became extinct, jumped into the middle of Greenland and split this stuff off, which is a big block of continental crust, which has now subsided beneath the ocean. So this is the kind of context that we're working in. This slide is also showing bathymetry. Here, the sunken continental areas along the edges, along the coasts, including the North Sea, are shown in dark brown here. And this is showing some geological features. So we've got some red lines here, one in Greenland here, and one is running down Scandinavia here and into Britain. Well, these red lines are marking an ancient mountain chain, if you like, an ancient mountain chain that was similar to the Alps. If you can imagine Greenland and Scandinavia and Britain as closed up together, so that the sea doesn't exist, they're together, then you'll see that this red line is lying quite close to this red line. And so we've got a zone, if you like, a mountain chain, which is running along here and through Britain. Okay, so this mountain chain is known as the Iapetus suture. Why did this old mountain chain exist? This old mountain chain existed heavily downward eroded at the time when the Atlantic opened. But where did it come from? Well, where it came from was that before the Atlantic okay, so I've described how the Greenland and Scandinavia were together and they opened to form the Atlantic. Well, obviously before that they were closed. But what happened before that was that there was an earlier ocean, an older ocean where the Atlantic now is, called the Iapetus Ocean. And this ocean closed, crashing Scandinavia and Greenland together and pushing up this mountain range, just as Africa is crashing into Europe at the present time and pushing the Alps up. So Scandinavia and Greenland crashed together about 400 million years ago and pushed up this mountain chain. So when this big megacontinent broke up again to form the Atlantic, what happened was a crack propagated up from the south here. When it reached this mountain chain, it couldn't go any further. It hit a barrier and was stuck. North of Iceland, a crack propagated south down here, and it also hit this mountain chain and it couldn't get across. So essentially, we had an ocean opening up to the north here, an ocean opening up to the south, and they couldn't break across. And what happened was, as the ocean opened in the south and it opened in the north, the region in between, which was continental obviously, just gradually deformed and stretched to form this, land bridge basically here. So as the Atlantic opened, this region here remained a land bridge above the surface of the ocean, allowing animals and plants to, my screen has disappeared, allowing animals and plants to move from Scandinavia across to Greenland until the ocean was about 1,000 kilometers wide. Actually, I seem to have lost the PowerPoint. Is this at my end or yours?
Yours, I believe.
Okay.
Whether you
say share screen again then.
Again, perhaps.
Okay.
Well, I think someone else might be screen sharing.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Okay. So so this is what we think happened. We think that the Atlantic opened up north of this Iceland region and south of the Iceland region, but these propagating cracks couldn't break through. And for those of you who are homeschooling small children, I've got a little demonstration here. Okay, so we'll say that this is the top crack that's propagating, and this is the, okay, so this is the northern crack, this is the southern crack. And if I pull this and try to make these cracks propagate, they don't join up. They just deform the area in the middle, and the cracks themselves don't ever join up. Those of you who've got some engineering knowledge will know that this is a characteristic of cracks. They propagate past each other and don't break up. So here are a couple of slides that illustrate this. So this shows the situation before the Atlantic started to open. These red stripes are where volcanic activity first started. And this slide shows these two cracks that formed, and this area in between could not be broken up. So here's another slide which gives you the picture. This green is supposed to be this mountain belt which simply could not be broken, and so it just stretched and deformed. I mentioned earlier that a big chunk of Greenland was broken off by a ridge jump, and we imagine that to be similar to this mechanism here, which shows an ancient, well, not an ancient, but the ice cap was ancient, but a few years ago, a huge chunk of the Larsen Sea Antarctic ice shelf broke up because a crack started at one end here. It propagated up here, and it gradually just peeled off this giant chunk of ice. And this is essentially what happened to break off a chunk of Greenland and float it out into the middle of the Atlantic. Now, if we look at the present day, and these black lines are isochrons, okay? So the red lines are active lines of volcanism about which eruptions and dikes are forming, pushing the two sides apart. So it's fairly simple in south of the Iceland area. These black lines are isochrons. So this line is the same age as this line. This line is the same age as this line. So we've got fairly regular pattern of opening up here to the south. To the north, okay, it's a little bit more complicated, but even so, you can make some sense of it. So the old ridge was here to begin with, and we've got this pattern of stripy isochrons on the seafloor. Then it jumped over here, and the same thing's happening over here. So that's kind of a little bit more complicated. We've got this old chunk of Greenland in the middle of the sea here. But in this region here, it's just a huge mess. The blue lines are ancient extinct volcanic zones, and the red lines again are presently active ones. Well, we have volcanism spread over a zone hundreds of kilometers wide in Iceland. And outside of Iceland, we have all of these old extinct ones. So what happened up here in the north just happened sort of once to a first approximation. But in this zone here, it was just happening all the time. Because we've got a swathe of continental crust that was stretching, the position where the volcanism happened was just jumping to and fro. And we've ended up with this extremely unusual long swathe of multiple parallel rifts. So, most geologists like going out into the field. They claim it's work, but in fact they're having a real ball. So why should we be different from anyone else? One of the French colleagues offered to take us to organize a field project in an area that he's familiar with that showed some of this phenomenon of dikes being thrust into continental rock and pushing the two sides apart. So off we went. And this was a very enjoyable expedition to West Greenland. So those of you who've been to Greenland will know that all the transport is by small plane or helicopter. This is a typical small village where we stayed for some of the time. But most of the time we traveled around on this ship called the Thorsild, which in Icelandic means Thor's herring. So I'm not quite sure whether which language this was in. The crew were Greenlanders, so they didn't presumably spoke Greenlandic. We had to get, because this little boat couldn't get into the beaches where we wanted to look at the geology, we would sail to some place of interest, and then we'd hop into these little boats here, and we'd be motored to the shore. And when we were traveling from place to place, these little boats were towed behind the ship. This is a real rogues gallery. I like this picture. It was taken by this French scientist here, obviously put his camera in the grass. And to me, I think this just looks great. He makes this look like a tremendous expedition of toughies. And this was actually published on the web, because he works for the Norwegian Geological Survey and has to make the work available to, obviously, the general public. So a French guy working in Norway, German guy, with this other German guy here, they came from the German Geological Survey. This is Professor Gernigan, Professor Geoffroy from University of Brest. This gentleman is from Switzerland. This gentleman is from the United States, and there's me, of course. So this was our accommodation. There were 7 of us, okay, and this was our accommodation for about 10 days. There was this tiny little bunk area in the front which had got 4 bunks in it. So 4 of us slept there, and the other 3 just slept in the dining room. So this was our entire accommodation. There's 3 of them obviously discussing there. I was standing filming this, and my back was rammed up against the kitchen sink. And this here is the toilet door. There was no shower or bath or anything like that. And this is the entire accommodation that 7 of us had for 10 days. So you'd think we might have been murdering each other and dropping the bodies overboard after this time, but there was absolutely, everybody just got along brilliantly. The only time when I saw a slight sign of frustration in this strange lockdown situation was when 3 of them went up onto the deck at something like 5 o'clock in the morning to try to catch some fish for dinner. And when I bounced out of bed at 8:30 and oh, did you catch anything then? And of course, no, they hadn't caught anything, and they didn't particularly like talking about the subject. So here we are preparing to get onto one of the little boats to go to shore. And we're looking at some plant fossils, probably about 60 million years old. And here's what we came to see. It's these dikes. Here they are. Here's a great blade of volcanic rock thrust into the existing sequence of sedimentary rocks. There's a 3rd one here. And they were just all over the place. Here's another one. Here's one that's cutting across it. And here's a 3rd one here. Here's one in the landscape. And the 2nd one here. So you very soon got your eye in. And here's one here. And as you can see, because these volcanic rocks are harder than the sedimentary rocks in which they're emplaced, when the sedimentary rocks weather away, you're just left with this vertical wall of rock. We saw some very remarkable examples of this. Here are some more. We do have an example of a rock of this type in County Durham. It's called the Het Dyke. And you can see outcrops of it at low force, and we take the undergraduates there from time to time. In fact, the local rocks that we have in the northeast, the volcanic rocks we have caught the attention of another colleague who works in Mumbai, and studies the Deccan Traps, which is a huge flood basalt in India. And he is due to come to Durham, I think, as an IAS fellow for a few months and work with me and my group. I think his visit may have been postponed to next summer because of the pandemic, but I shall certainly bring him into college and introduce him to you all when he's able to come. Here we have one which obviously people have gone up to see, and lots of spectacular walking and views. And here, once you get your eye in, you see these things everywhere. So those of you who've got a good eye will be able to see here where I'm pointing that there's one of these slabs of intruded volcanic rock actually cropping out of the ground. There were lots of vigorous discussions. This Swiss scientist was not entirely convinced by our theories, but hopefully he learned a lot and got some good discussions in, and beautiful landscape. And some Inuit archaeology, which I was very interested in. I was hoping we might see some of the Norse archaeology while we were there, but unfortunately we didn't go to any of those sites, so we'll just have to go again. So just coming to the last section of this talk and wrapping up here, this zone here, which we now believe to be underlain by a large amount of continental crust, you don't see this because this continental crust has stretched and thinned, and it's been blanketed on the top by lavas. So there's a thick sequence of lavas sitting on top of this. So to test this hypothesis properly, we'd need either a deep drill hole, or we need some new technique which can tell us what the makeup of the rocks several kilometers under the surface are. Geochemistry can partly do this because the new volcanic rock that's rising up is passing through this continental material, so it's picking up geochemical signatures on its way up, and colleagues are working on that. It's called the Thulian land bridge because people always knew that there was a land bridge across here, and so it's been given this name. So my colleagues and I have drawn up this map where we've outlined with this purple line the region that we think is underlain by a large amount of continental material. So obviously we know Greenland and Britain and Scandinavia are underlain by continental material, and the North Sea. This is the big chunk of Greenland that was broken off, the so-called Jan Mayen microcontinent, so that's fairly well accepted too. It's pretty well accepted that the Hatton Bank and the Rockall Trough are continental material, and the Faroe Islands are sitting on continental material. So we have added this swathe here, which we propose is continental material, and we propose that this whole purple area here and this pink area here is what we call Icelandia. So we're basically proposing that there's an additional continent here which was not previously known about. Scientists have recognized in the past that there is more continental material than just what stands above the sea. And this region here has been dubbed Zealandia. It's surrounded by this pink line here, which has been drawn by researchers. And it's proposed that New Zealand is basically just the tip of a huge continent. And it's just the part that sticks up above the sea. So New Zealand is similar to Iceland in many different respects, and it could be that in being just the tip of the continental iceberg, if you like, that that's another way in which it shares things in common with Iceland. And even more recently, this part of the Indian Ocean has been suggested by researchers to be underlain by a considerable amount of continental crust, and this has been called Marusha. So my colleagues and I drew up this picture where we've drawn in red here, we've coloured in red the areas in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean which we propose are underlain by continental crust. And so there's quite a lot more here than has previously been thought. Why is this important? Well, many of these patches of sea floor where we think there's now continental material have previously been suggested by colleagues to have been formed by mantle plumes. So as I mentioned earlier, I've contested the mantle plume theory for many years, but now all of a sudden we've come up with a theory as to why these places are, if you like, which is a little bit more generic. So if these regions are in fact continental regions where there's oceanic crust, thin oceanic crust on one side and thick continental crust on another side, it's not difficult to imagine that internal deformations in this material can open up cracks along the edges, and these are the regions that are preferred for magmas rising up from below. So this, for example, has been proposed to be the trace of a mantle plume passing under the ocean. And if it's all continental crust, well, nobody's going to be suggesting that a mantle plume is there again. It would just be too much of a crazy coincidence. Of course, it's also important from the point of natural resources, because continental crust is where the minerals and the hydrocarbon resources are. So nations are interested in knowing where this continental crust is. And perhaps of even greater importance is the question of sovereign boundaries. Nations tend to think that the continental crust that extends beyond their coastlines into the sea, that should be part of their sovereign territory. And two hotspots of this sort, if you like, at the moment are the South China Sea, where China is doing a very great deal of geological research because it's hoping to produce arguments, if you like, in favor that the South China Sea should be governed by China and should not be international waters. And also the Arctic Ocean. So the Arctic Ocean is thought to contain a lot of oil resources and to be of great strategic importance. And I recently became aware that Russia has conducted an experiment with a budget of space program proportions to study the Arctic Ocean and see if it's underlain by continental crust. Because if it is, then they have an argument there for claiming that this should be Russian territory. And when a Russian colleague told me exactly what had been done there, I was absolutely mind-boggled, because there were billions of dollars spent on this. They built new research vessels and went out and took tens of thousands of seismic lines at vast expense to study the Arctic Ocean. And I've been receiving quite a lot of communications and encouragements to work with them, because we got our results about Iceland and the continental crust under that region out just recently, and this is a perfect scientific theory from their point of view. So we'll just have to see where that goes, won't we? And I think I've prevailed on all of your patience long enough now, so it just remains for me to give a huge thank you to Chads. This was just a perfect little crucible of peace and quiet and freedom from distraction, where we could hatch out all of these ideas. And I'm very grateful for that, and would not hesitate to run future meetings at Chads. The catering was wonderful, everybody was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Gillian, thank you very much indeed. We ought to give you a round of applause. That's tricky on Zoom. There is a little reactions button at the bottom of the screen that allows you to put a clapping hand, or I guess jazz hands might work, or people can unmute themselves and give you a round of applause. Yes, thank you very much, Gillian. That was wonderful. You might want to stop sharing your screen at this point, Gillian, and then we can see you again. There is going to be some time for some questions, which we will run through the chat facility. So you should all have on your screen an option for chat. If you can, if people want to just post their full name there, I will call on people to ask their question. They can unmute themselves, ask the question, and perhaps a follow-up. If you haven't got a microphone, you could post the question into chat, and we'll see how we go. So either post your name or your question into chat, and I'll read them out for everybody to hear. Nobody?
Actually, it takes a while to type in, I think. Yeah.
Can you hear me, Ashley?
I can.
This is Colin Woodward. Yeah, I'm typing.
Actually, I wonder if there's
I have a question from Curtis asking, is there evidence of supervolcanoes in Iceland?
Well, a supervolcano is really just a very, very, very big volcano. So the answer to that is really no. There's no volcano in Iceland which could do, for example, what Yellowstone has done in the past. And Iceland may be a nuisance to European air flights, for example, but it's not going to devastate the entire planet as a supervolcano could do.
Thank you.
Anybody else? So from Margaret, how is this new theory being received? And how good are scientists at changing their minds?
Well, this new theory has not yet been published. My colleagues and I we've published one paper where we've proposed that there's a lot of continental crust there, and but we haven't published the paper which names it Icelandia. That paper has been submitted for publication, and I'm expecting that to be published in a few months, and the university's all set to make a press release on that as soon as they hear that the paper's been accepted. So St. Chad's College has got the first, you're the first to receive a lecture on the subject of Icelandia. As for the the earlier suggestion that there's continental crust under the Iceland region, there's been a kind of deathly silence from the community. I think it's the lull before the storm. I'm completely confident about this. This is the only theory that can explain the many, many very strange things that we see in Iceland. And I think it's going to take people a little bit of time to swallow it, because if you made a list of the last 1,000 papers that were published on the Iceland region, they would all say there was a mantle plume there. So accepting that there isn't is not something that people are just going to say, oh yes, that's great, thanks a lot. It's going to follow a somewhat different path. The scientific community is comfortable with people making small steps forward. But if people try to make a huge step forward, then the barrier to acceptance, the height of the hurdle tends to be higher. It takes people longer to chew over that. So I suppose, you know, the difference between my work and a lot of work is that I try to take a big step at a time, which isn't necessarily the best thing for one's career, because that's much more difficult. It means you publish papers less frequently. But I think it's going to take the scientific community a certain while to get their heads around this, because it's such a radical suggestion, and it flies in the face of everything done by Lamont Doherty University, everything done by Cambridge University, everything done by Oxford, everything done by all the big boys. I suspect they're not going to acquiesce easily. But
okay, there's another question. A question from Colin. What is the ocean depth of your proposed Icelandia continent?
it's just a few hundred meters.
This is Colin. I was thinking about the potential for natural resources extraction.
Oh,
Right.
good.
So much of it is at the same depth as the Norwegian seaboards, where a lot of hydrocarbons are obtained.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, a question from Elizabeth. How can Gillian explain the little islands cropping up around the south of Iceland?
These little islands, especially to the south, as I mentioned in one slide, the mode in which the Iceland and that region there is stretching is not clean like on the ocean floor. You know, a normal ocean, we think, has got a big crack down the middle, and this crack is gradually widening and widening, filling out with magma, and the two sides moving apart. But in Iceland, we've just got ridges jumping about all over the place, because this is not normal oceanic crust, and so the rift can't settle in one stable position. And those little islands are essentially the tip of a southward propagating crack, which is a new position that the rift, the zone of volcanism, is trying to establish for itself. So this is the fact that there's volcanic activity on the in the southwest of Iceland, and also over there further to the east and south of Iceland. This is just part of this very broad volcanic region, which is different from normal ocean.
Okay, there's another question from Annie. Is mantle plume likely to produce a big continent?
A mantle plume does not form a continent, no. When we talk about continents, we essentially mean continental rocks like sediments and coal and that kind of thing.
Oh.
We don't mean ocean. So there are essentially two kinds of crust, if you like. There's continental crust and there's oceanic crust. Oceanic crust, we think, is all volcanic, and continental crust is different kind of rock. It's a rock that contains a lot of sediments. It forms very thick sequence, and it forms continents. So mantle plumes are thought to form very thick sequences of volcanics, which basically means very thick sea floor, if you like.
Thank you.
So a mantle plume is not going to form a continent, no.
Okay, Ian, were you wanting to ask a question?
Yeah, I don't really understand how to do this. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
That's brilliant. Because I'm trying to type something, but never mind. Yeah, look, two questions. First is a factual thing about simple question about risk to the United Kingdom due to volcanic plumes or erupting volcanoes in or around Iceland. That's the first question that I didn't quite understand when you were answering a question by Curtis Runstedler. You said there was no risk. I thought you did, but that runs counter to what we were being told in the news some time ago, when the aviation was brought to a complete halt by the outpourings of a volcano in Iceland, I thought. That's just first question, factual. Second is ethical question about continental crust, which is, of course, containing carboniferous material, oil, whatever. Should we even be thinking about that in the way, in light of the, it's an ethical question about the environment, really. Should we even be thinking about this or encouraging anyone to explore this further? Right, that's it.
Okay, so as regards the first, Curtis asked if there was a supervolcano in Iceland. A supervolcano is a volcano that's capable of producing an absolutely ginormous eruption that could essentially devastate half the planet. Iceland does not have volcanoes of that kind. It has volcanoes that produce a lot of ash, that produce a lot of lava, but the effects are generally local, although the plumes of volcanic material from these volcanoes can obviously inconvenience air travel in Europe. But there's no volcano like Yellowstone in Iceland, which could essentially blanket the entire continent with, you know, several feet of ash. That's my answer to the first question. As to the ethical question, you know, that's really a separate subject. I mean, geologists can tell you about the geology, or at least we try to get it right, and so forth. But to discuss ethics is really a completely separate problem that shouldn't really be mixed in with the geology. I think it's important to study and understand our planet and know what's going on, but as to my personal opinion about whether we should be looking for more oil resources, you know, that's obviously not the way society is going in general. And yes, I would agree with you that we need to wean ourselves off that. But I don't think it means we should stop trying to understand the planet better.
Thank you. We are a little bit over time. I said we'd try and keep to an hour, and we're just at an hour and 5 minutes. So I just wondered if there's a final question that anybody would like to ask. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one. No, doesn't look as though there's any burning questions. Well, you need to do another round of applause, I think. Jazz hands, wavy hands, whatever. And then I think Margaret wants to say a few words just to close.
Yes, just to say that's been absolutely fascinating, Gillian, at many, many different levels. I think one of the things that I found intriguing is imagining this going on in September 2017, just around the time that the rest of college is getting ready for Freshers Week and, you know, thinking about how many bedrooms and all of these really important but relatively routine things. And we love it when there are conferences and things going on in college, but often we don't actually know the kind of thinking that's going on there. And it is slightly mind-blowing to think that while we're getting on with that, you know, something quite remarkable is unfolding, you know, in the Williams Library in college. So it's been wonderful just to have that insight. Unfortunately, you've probably raised our expectations. We probably now assume that all these amazing world-shattering thoughts are going on at every academic conference. And having been to some, I know that that doesn't happen every time or all the time. But that's been fascinating. And, you know, at some stage, we don't have time now, it'd be lovely to hear just more about that sense of the aha moments when you got beyond thinking, well, that doesn't work and that doesn't work and that doesn't work, and how you get into thinking, well, maybe this, because that must be quite a remarkable thing, I think, to live through. So thank you for the insights into that. I think then it's been lovely to see people gathering here. So we've had students, we've had college fellows, we've had tutors, we've had postgraduates, we've had alumni, we've had your guests, we've had some staff members. And I think together we would have just about filled the Williams Library. But it's been also lovely to meet in this virtual space. And it's worked remarkably well, you know, so I think the technology served us very well. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Thank you especially to Gillian for sharing that with us. And just to say, I think that this will give us confidence to do more of this. We already know that our postgraduates are eager to share their regular research forums in this arena. And our undergraduates will be very keen to do this after exams and to share the kind of insights that they glean through their undergraduate dissertation. So we'll make sure we advertise these and people can come back and join us for these. But on behalf of all of us, Gillian, thank you very much for that remarkable insight, and congratulations on, I suppose, being the catalyst to bringing these people together and facilitating this breakthrough. And I feel very proud of the fact that it happened to happen in the Williams Library in St Chad's College, and thank you for acknowledging our humble role in that. Great to see everyone. enjoy the rest of your day, Gillian. Enjoy your evening to those of you who are in the time zone here. And very much look forward to seeing you at our next CHADS online lecture or intellectual occasion. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right.